Hey everybody, so this is our last lecture for government before I do the review. So we're going to talk about civil rights, and there's a lot to it that we're going to compress into a very short lecture. And we're going to be talking primarily through the African American experience in America. So if you look at the history of the United States, we know that in 1619, probably the first slaves were brought over. By the time of the American Revolution, about 20% of the country was enslaved. In South Carolina, the population was 60% slave. And there was some talk in the Declaration of maybe adding that the evils of slavery were brought on us by King George. And that really wasn't true. Boston and Rhode Islanders profited immensely from slavery, whereas Southern slaveholders were eager participants in the slave trade as well. So it was struck out. When they finally get around to the Constitution, they stay away from slavery. In fact, the word slavery doesn't appear in the Constitution. Even with the Three-Fifths Compromise, they avoid the word. They knew that was going to be a difficult issue. Slavery pops up again with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. There were people who were fearing that this would lead to more slave states. Then again in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise on allowing slave states, free states. In 1832 with the Nullification Crisis, one of the reasons for that was in South Carolina. They didn't like the growing criticism of slavery in the North. And then when we get to 1840, we see our first anti-slavery party, the Liberty Party, with James G. Birney as their presidential candidate. The Mexican-American War. Even pro-slavery people like John C. Calhoun thought this was going to be a dangerous precedent, having these new lands, and that slavery might divide the country. And then anti-slavery people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the leading transcendentalists at the time, also felt that way. The Wilmot Proviso, when was added on or attempted to be added on to the Declaration of War, saying that slavery would be not allowed in any territory acquired from Mexico. Of course, that didn't pass. And then in 1850, the Compromise of 1850 was all about the issue of slavery. I mean, you can read the words of John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, where they're predicting that if we don't solve the slavery question, we're going to see civil war. They're about 10 years before that actually happens. Then we get to the Kansas-Nebraska Crisis, where Kansas really becomes a battleground for Civil War. The northern part of Kansas is going to be a free state. They didn't want slavery there. The southern part of Kansas was pro-slavery, and they actually have a civil war in 1856 and 1857 between those two sides in Kansas. And then we see with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it would be the birth of the Republican Party, as the Whig Party will be destroyed by the issue of slavery. And we get the Republican Party, and they run their first presidential candidate, John Fremont, in 1856, and the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, in 1860. But in 1857, we want to talk about, this is really where you need to start paying closer attention to these things that are going to be on the multiple choice, is we're going to talk about Dred Scott versus Sanford. Now, I'll tell you briefly about the case. I just want you to know what the ruling is. In Dred Scott versus Sanford, Dred Scott had been born into slavery in Virginia somewhere around 1800. He was then taken to St. Louis, Missouri, where in 1830 he was sold to an army surgeon. The army surgeon then went into Illinois, a free state, and then into Wisconsin, a free territory. And then in 1840, returned back to St. Louis, Missouri, and then died around 1843. Well, Scott had saved some money, and so he tries to buy his freedom from the widow. She won't sell, but Scott's a good American, and all good Americans sue, and he takes it to a jury trial in Missouri with the argument that once he was taken into a free state and a free territory, he became free, and once free, forever free. The jury actually agreed with him, but the state will appeal this, and it'll eventually go to the Supreme Court. And so what the Supreme Court rules in Dred Scott versus Sanford is that Scott they argue, can't sue. And the Chief Justice was Roger B. Taney, a slaveholder, and he held that Scott cannot sue because he's not a citizen. He's not even a person. He's property. And therefore, he has no standing to sue. It'd be like saying a chair can't sue you, is what Taney was saying. Well, if you think that's bad, he's going to make the decision worse. He goes on to say that blacks had no rights that white people had to respect because they were so inferior to white people. He went on to say that any attempt at interfering with slave trade would be a violation of the Bill of Rights. Now you might be going, wait a minute, how can a document be used, that's designed for freedom, be used to ensure slavery? Well, Taney argues that the Fifth Amendment says that you cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. Therefore, since slaves are property, the Congress cannot get in there and just say, you can't take your property to this state. It's a terrible decision. And I always tell students that what's important about this decision is that in some ways, along the road, is that just because the Supreme Court rules something doesn't mean you have to agree with it, because this is clearly a horrible decision and really starts moving the country closer to civil war. Well, so we get to civil war, and as we all know, the North wins. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. We've already talked about the 14th Amendment, and the idea was that a lot of southern states were trying to keep the trappings of slavery. And so the 14th Amendment was expanding citizenship, protecting rights. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, we've talked about this in a previous unit, granted African-American men the right to vote. But even with all this, you're still going to see this rise of the black codes, this legal separation, sometimes called Jim Crow, of the country, because Southerners just did not like the idea of no slavery. And so they wanted to keep freedmen's rights down to a minimum. And one of the things they did was they thought the best thing to do was to separate the races. And they did this in Louisiana. They said, look, when it comes to traveling by the railroad, you're going to have separate cars for white people and a separate car for black people. Now, the train companies were opposed to this because this meant adding another train. And even some African Americans were opposed to this because this meant that they'd put the drunk whites in with them rather than with everybody else. And they didn't like the fact that they had to sit in a separate car anyway. There was a lot of complaining about this. And Louisiana says, let's test this case. Well, a group of African American businessmen in Louisiana decided to test this case. And so what they're going to do is they're going to get this man by the name of Homer Plessy, and they're going to say, okay, we're going to buy you a ticket, and you're going to go sit in the white section. Now, Homer Plessy is somebody who they would refer to as an octoroon, 1/8 African American, or 7/8 white, either way you want to say it. And the idea was that if they allowed him to ride in the white section of the car, then they were going to find somebody who was 1/4 African American, and then they were going to find somebody who's 1/2. So in other words, challenge the law and even challenge the state to decide who's black and who's white. Well, Homer Plessy tries to get on a train. He's arrested. This case is appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in the famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, if I'm not mistaken, says that separate but equal is legal. They said you can have separate facilities as long as they are equal. Now, what does that mean? Who knows? And are they ever equal? No. We'll see this in education and everywhere else. So this means that you're going to have separate rail cars, separate churches, separate schools, and you're going to see that the African-American schools are historically underfunded, separate universities, you name it. And this separate but equal doctrine will stand for almost 60 years. It'll slowly begin breaking down in a couple of cases that we're not going to go through here, Sweat versus Painter and McLaurin versus Oklahoma. But it really breaks down in 1954 in the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education. in which the Supreme Court will overturn the separate but equal doctrine by declaring that separate educational facilities based on race are inherently unequal and therefore a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. So what is the Supreme Court saying there? They're saying as soon as you separate people by race, you're implying one is inferior to the other. And they will order the desegregation of the public schools with all deliberate speed. Well, this is heavily resisted by southern states. There's the Southern Manifesto, which said they should unite to resist this. There's the white citizens councils that they create in many states. And so you see near riots, like in this picture behind me, right to my, this side, Elizabeth Eckford, she's part of the Little Rock Nine, trying to get into her school. They had to bring out the military to allow her to get into the school. And you can see this lady yelling at her behind her. Interesting story. I got to meet Miss Eckford 2 years ago in Little Rock. And she talked about that day. And what was also interesting is that this lady behind her, which I can't remember her name. Wait, I still can't get, there we go. Her name. Oop. You see her, she's right behind my ear. That lady saw that picture and thought, my God, do I look that hateful? And they two eventually became friends and actually wrote a book together. Interesting, but she was a really dynamic speaker. I heard her speak in the Little Rock Central High School library. It was pretty exciting. You sort of get sort of speechless when you see famous people that are historically important in front of you. Anyway, that's me being a history nerd. Well, now when we say with all deliberate speed, the Supreme Court will have to order that again in 1972 in Swan versus Mecklenburg, a school district. So it doesn't happen very fast. In fact, today, a majority of minority students attend schools that are majority minority. That's because there are two types of segregation, and this will show up on your test. There is de jure, which means by law, and that's unconstitutional, that's illegal. But then there's de facto, which means that's the reality of the neighborhood, that there are certain neighborhoods that are predominantly of one ethnicity, and that school becomes that one ethnicity. So you probably can think of which are the Hispanic schools in Fort Worth or in Dallas, which are the African-American schools in those two counties. You probably could name them pretty quickly. Now, when you say de facto, but even then, that's not very accidental. Redlining, deed restrictions have forced minorities into certain districts. And that's when you see those schools become majority minority. Interestingly enough, the state that has the most segregated school system right now is New York. So a long way to go. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's one of the most important pieces of legislation of the 20th century. And part of this act outlawed discrimination in all public accommodations, restaurants, hotels, you name it. And so that brought up the question is, okay, you can understand where the federal government gets the power to tell the school district, which is a organ of the state, that they have to desegregate. But where does the federal government get the power to tell a hotel owner who owns the building, owns the beds, the rooms, the sheets, everything, who he has to serve and he can't serve? Where does the government get that power? And even though you might say the law is a good law, it has to find justification for its actions. If you remember all the way back to Unit 1, we said we had limited government. So where does the government get the justification to tell somebody's private business who they can and cannot serve? Well, that's the question in the case of the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. And the Supreme Court said that if your business benefits from interstate commerce, you are therefore subject to federal civil rights laws. Well, today almost every business does benefit from interstate commerce. Things come across state lines all the time. And this becomes something else that's important to note when we start talking about this, is that you see some of this playing out today. So if you're a baker and you don't want to bake a cake for a same-sex couple, do you have that right? How's that different than saying, I don't want to bake a cake for a mixed-race couple? How does that work? And so that becomes an issue. Some say that the court should step in. Some say let the marketplace decide. You decide whether you want to go to that baker ever again, or you want to shop at that baker, either one. Well, something else we want to talk about just briefly, and that's affirmative action. Affirmative action was a program that was started in the 60s designed to redress past wrongs. And the idea is, and this applies to the government or businesses that do business with the government. If you own your own business and you're not doing anything else, then you can hire whoever you want. So the idea of affirmative action is that if you have 2 equally qualified candidates or 3, then preference should be given to the historically disadvantaged group. And that becomes difficult to manage what is meant by equally qualified. It can have the double-edged sword. You might be the most qualified person in a minority and you get the job and somebody goes, well, you only got it because you're a minority. It's very controversial and has been for some time as a way of trying to redress past discrimination that still exists today. So that sums it up very quickly. Like I said, that was a short lecture. Normally in class, we'd go a little bit more detail in a face-to-face class. So my next lecture will be a review for the next test. So we'll catch up then.